this hour. As the globe heats up with record-breaking extreme weather, we take you on a journey to the front lines of the climate story. Rising seas in Senegal, deadly heat in the American West, loss of home and habitat on the Pacific Islands.
If tomorrow the land disappears from beneath your feet, are you going to leave?
The best journalists on the beat, giving us an unprecedented look at the climate story right now.
All of this is swept by the ocean.
The future is going to be more of the same, but just more intense.
How people all across the world are suffering, are adapting.
This was all like crops.
Exposing corruption and corporate deceit.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes.
Demanding change from their leaders and working through new solutions.
3, 2, 1.
Are we going to save ourselves from going over the climate cliff or not? That's the burning question of our time.
Join us as we explore the climate story, asking the burning questions, covering climate now.
Funding for this program was provided by Sustainable Markets Foundation, Schumann Media Center, Park Foundation, One Earth Fund, Rockefeller Family Fund, the Michaud Family Foundation, Taylor Family Charitable Fund, and Actions at EBMF.
Hi, everybody. Welcome from Rockefeller Center in New York. I'm Al Roker.
And I'm Savannah Sellers, and this was a year of more extremes. We're seeing potent examples of the dramatic ways climate change is altering our world. And it's getting hard to remember what was once normal. From catastrophic flooding, devastating drought, heat waves, and wildfires, around the world we continue to break records with intense and punishing weather.
And with all this change coming at us so quickly, there are so many burning questions that need answers.
What does the future hold? How bad can it get? What can we do about it? And will we do it in time?
To help answer those questions, we're going to turn to some of the best reporters on the climate beat, all of them recognized by this year's Covering Climate Now Journalism Awards, reporting from the front lines on where we are with the climate story today.
Scientists have been saying for decades that this is what was going to happen. If you keep pumping greenhouse gases into the air, if you keep burning so much oil and gas and coal, you will raise the temperatures on the planet. There will be heat waves, there will be droughts, there will be famines, there will be flooding, there will be sea level rise. And guess what? That's exactly what's happening.
The climate story is now evolving very, very fast from a story that impacted mostly poor people in poor countries. But now it's a global phenomenon.
There is just obviously more awareness because people understand that the climate change is here now, and it's not something about the future.
This is one of the biggest challenges that humanity has ever faced. I mean, we have to change basically every aspect of how we create and use energy in this country and every other country in the world.
We have a responsibility to cover it, and the way to do that is to cover it from all angles, but in particular to speak with people whose lives have been completely upended because of where they happen to be born and where they live.
We know what's happening, we know the path that we're on, and so journalism has really started to shift its focus to what does this mean for people? Who are those people? How do we tell the story about where does this go? Like, what happens to these people?
Where are we now covering the climate story? The best journalists are connecting the dots between the science and what it means for people's daily lives.
The impact's already being felt around the world, and that 300 million people around the world will be vulnerable to coastal flooding by 2050.
As part of a team of reporters for Agence France Presse, journalist Kelly McNamara revealed the draft of a landmark UN report, giving viewers a detailed global look at coastal cities on the front line of climate change, exploring how quickly the water could rise and what could follow.
There are cities today that will be Atlantises tomorrow. Not just sections of cities, but some whole cities.
One of the things we really wanted to do was to look at 2050 as our main target, because This is within most people's lifetimes. And so that really gives you this sense of how near term some of these risks are.
We could see more sea level rising faster than we anticipated. And it's going to be the speed that kills, right? A bullet isn't dangerous if I'm holding it in my hand or tossing it at you. Speed makes it dangerous. And speed is what will make sea level rise more devastating than anything else.
It will redraw the map of the world. We are definitely doing that already, right now. And our choice is how far this goes. You know, how do we let it go further than that?
Many of the world's major cities are among those most threatened. Mumbai, Jakarta, New York, Tokyo, Lagos, Shanghai, Miami o Dhaka.
L'innalzamento di 50 cm sarebbe catastrofico per Venezia. Vuol dire che avremmo sempre l'acqua in piazza San Marco.
While some countries like the Netherlands are ingeniously adapting to sea level rise, other countries simply don't have the resources.
One of the really interesting cities to focus on was Rotterdam because, you know, a huge amount of the city itself is technically below sea level. They have managed to build loads of heavy-duty infrastructure, floating farms, seawalls, to, you know, keep their feet dry. But other countries maybe just will not be able to have the capacity or have the money to build such large, heavy-duty what they call hard adaptation measures to protect themselves.
The greatest impact by far is going to be on people without the financial resources and social resources to move or adapt.
Some places will be hit much, much harder and be way more vulnerable, but everywhere is going to see really severe impacts if we don't bring down temperatures.
Thousands of miles away in Iraq, that loss of culture is not just a coastal threat. Photojournalist Emily Garthwaite discovering communities who are facing the end of their way of life.
Iraq is actually an example of a country which is, for all matters, landlocked, but has already lost a lot of its land. It's a story which has already happened.
At the heart of Iraq's climate crisis are the marsh Arab communities who have been residing in the marshes of the Tigris and Euphrates for centuries.
And these marshes are enormous. They cover what was and remains Mesopotamia. What we know from the local communities that we spoke to is that whilst it may appear green and lush, the biodiversity is at an all-time low. You've got highly salinated water that is toxic for fish, cracked earth, boats left to the side, dead water buffalo. Breaks my heart to think that right now none of that exists in every single community that we interview that's in displaced.
Now, the marsh Arabs have gone through changes in the past. During the times of Saddam, the marshes were dried up, but they were restored. But now we are seeing the even greater risks of not a political leader, but the risks of man-made climate change affecting this area.
As Emily's expedition traveled the Tigris, temperatures reached as high as 52 degrees Celsius. That's 125 degrees Fahrenheit.
It is unfathomable. You cannot function. You cannot think. And at one point, my body temperature got too high. We had to put ice blocks across my body to try and cool it down.
But Emily is determined to cover the beauty of Iraq and what is at risk of being lost.
I love working in Iraq. I love the country. It makes my soul sing. And this is where civilizations were born. This is where cities were first created. This is a shared history and this is a shared problem.
A shared problem, hard to ignore through a barrage of extreme weather.
I think the fight now has become very urgent and very clear that we need to take action.
We are crossing the Rubicon from what used to be something that will happen, that we can prevent, to something that's already happened that we failed to prevent.
Last year in British Columbia, a summer of historic heat leading to a cascade of climate disasters, from extreme temperatures, wildfires, and mudslides.
One of the things I was most struck by when I took on the environment beat was just how interconnected all of these climate change fueled weather events really are.
Catherine Blaise-Baum and a team at the Globe and Mail newspaper explained the connection of those disparate weather events, starting with a summer of record-breaking heat.
Last summer, there was a crazy heat dome that had settled over BC. Now all of a sudden, these people who have no air conditioning and their bodies are just not remotely acclimated to that kind of temperature are all of a sudden existing in this new world.
Much of British Columbia was unprepared, and no one felt the pressure like first responders. Vancouver's Assistant Fire Chief Brian Bertuzzi recalling one night in June 2021 unlike any in his 30-year career.
We were warned to expect a heat dome, which we have never experienced. We had unprecedented heat wave come through settled upon us for days, and unforeseen problems that arose from it.
Emergency medical services were just completely overwhelmed, and people just could not get through to 911, or if they were getting through to 911, they were being told that it could be, a lengthy wait for an ambulance.
Things just went crazy. Every single firefighter was attending a medical call related to heat. Next thing you know, we had no fire trucks left. Never experienced anything like this in my career before, and it physically and mentally burned me out.
And the historic heat triggered more disasters.
First comes heat, then comes wildfires, then comes flooding.
Globe and Mail journalist Nancy McDonald experienced the flooding firsthand, reporting the devastation brought on by the raging waters.
We had just pounding rain for days on end. What are generally fairly shallow, winding streams and rivers turned into just torrents of raging water. And they took out farms and whole communities. No one was able to stop long enough to kind of take stock of what had happened. The last year in BC, we've kind of come to realize that this is that normal that we've known for decades and generations is over. No longer recognized our province. It was this weird feeling of like you're almost homesick for the place you knew.
We are here to illuminate some of these issues kind of on a day-to-day basis and really bring people into these stories and help raise awareness about where we're at now and where we need to be.
Where are we now? So many people affected. They see the changes happening out their window and want to understand, why is this happening?
To answer that question, one veteran reporter in Charleston, South Carolina, who witnessed increased flooding on his city's coastlines, decided to travel thousands of miles to find out why.
It's helpful to understand where I live to help understand why it was so important for us to connect the dots. Charleston, South Carolina is in the low country that is, for the most part, is just a few feet above sea level. So every inch of sea rise makes a big difference here. At one point, we saw about an inch of sea rise a decade. Then we began to see an acceleration of that sea rise. So now we're at a rate of 3.2 inches per decade. And then it keeps going up. Once upon a time, it flooded at high tide in Charleston maybe once every year or two. Now it happens 50 to 80 to 90 times a year.
To help explain these rising tides to his readers, Tony Bartlemay had a destination in mind, far from their Charleston home, Greenland.
We had this kind of simple idea about a very complex project, and that was simply to go watch the ice melt. I'll never forget getting out of the plane, getting into a taxi and going down to town and seeing the icebergs off in the distance. And it was a really emotional thing for me to see because of the sheer scale of what was before me. It began to give me an idea of really just the enormous forces that are taking place on our planet and how not many people get to see that.
With photographer Lauren Petraka, the team landed in a small town where one of the largest glaciers on the planet is toppling into the sea.
We spent a lot of time in this town called Ilulissat. It has the biggest receding glacier.
And that's where the Greenland ice sheet flows into the ocean.
So we knew we wanted to go there because that is where the most visual ice melt is happening and where you can see these giant icebergs breaking off the ice sheet.
creates the most beautiful traffic jam in the world. Giant icebergs for 30 or 40 miles flowing out to sea.
The reporting team arranged to meet a group from NASA studying the ice melt. NASA's lead scientist, Climate Elvis.
You take a bunch of weather and you average it together, and you're doing the climate rock.
Years ago, I these sideburns started getting a little longer and longer, and somebody called me Climate Elvis, and it sort of stuck.
He, like a lot of journalists, struggle with how to tell the climate story to regular people in a compelling way. So he's using humor as his route.
Oh yeah.
According to Josh Willis, Greenland is currently the single largest source of sea level rise. The ice there could raise global sea levels by almost 25 feet if it all melted today.
Greenland is about the size of Mexico, or 3 times the size of Texas, and 80% of that island is covered in ice.
To better understand the forces at play, the team headed deep into glacier territory aboard a plane that was 80 years old.
Well, you know, if you're going slow, you can turn a little tighter. That's important for getting in and out of small places and getting access to these little areas in the ice that were important to us.
We flew with them in this old plane from the 1930s. It was the scariest flight of my life. I already don't like flying.
We had a really great team flying these planes around, plus we looked like we were in an Indiana Jones movie.
Those old DC-3s were key for Josh's mission, flying low and slow, trying to pinpoint small patches of water in the ice, a small bullseye in a field of white.
And so you're flying around in them looking for a little patch of open water. And when you see one, then you have to carefully fly around it.
3, 2, 1, drop.
Drop the probe at exactly the right time so it hits that open spot in the water. One piece stayed at the surface and it radios data back to the airplane, and the other piece falls down through the water and it measures the ocean conditions as it goes.
After 6 years of missions, one of the many discoveries was that Greenland's waters are what Josh calls upside down.
Normally, the warm water's at the top because warm water tends to be lighter. But in Greenland, the warm water comes from the Atlantic Ocean, which is the saltiest ocean on the planet, and the cold water comes from the Arctic, which is the freshest ocean on the planet. And so that difference in saltiness actually makes the warm water heavier.
Their discovery was the temperature of the ocean has a dramatic effect on the ice sheet of Greenland. And then you have a greater amount of ice falling into the ocean, and that all plays into the idea of rising seas.
Almost every time we made a discovery, we found out that the oceans were more important than we thought. And what that literally means is that we have to raise the bar on our predictions of sea level rise. They're going to be higher than we expected.
Josh's team is now working to come up with new predictions for sea level rise in the decades ahead to help the world prepare.
It's sometimes a little disorienting for people, I think, to realize that what's going on so far away has this impact on your own doorstep. But every ton of ice that's lost from Greenland raises sea levels in South Carolina just a little bit. And the same is true all over the planet. Every foot of sea level rise is hundreds of millions of more people affected.
And for Tony and Lauren, their trip to Greenland was transformative.
I felt just very privileged to see a place of just enormous beauty and wonder.
My trip to Greenland was, it was life-changing. I just fell in love with the place. My aim was to show the visual connections between the two places. So I have a picture of, an iconic bridge in Charleston at sunset with the same sunset over an iceberg in Greenland. There's another photograph that shows the big iceberg that's broken off from the ice sheet, and then there's a photograph that shows this tree that's outside of Charleston, where this beach has been eroded by rising seas, and these trees are just falling into the water. So I really wanted to show kind of cause and effect as well as similarities to make people feel connected to the other place. And it was also just proof to me of, how fast this is happening and the urgency that we have to act and the importance of telling these stories.
Savannah, I actually flew with Climate Elvis, I should say Josh, back in 2019. And yeah, those plane rides are a bit scary, but the views, spectacular. And their discoveries are helping us understand that the impacts of climate change will be much greater and come more quickly than we've been expecting. And so another burning question naturally follows. If we know the dangers ahead, why has it been so difficult to do something about it? What's stopping us from taking the rapid, far-reaching action science says is essential?
Let me start first by formally welcoming you to Glasgow.
The problems we're talking about are much longer than 1 or 2 political cycles. So no elected leader right now could pass a piece of legislation that they're going to see a tangible impact on climate within their term in office. And unfortunately, we live in a short-sighted society, in a short-sighted world.
The lights are flashing red on the climate dashboard.
Last year, the 26th Conference of the Parties, or COP26, convened representatives from all the world's nations, working, planning, negotiating on agreements for global plans to respond to climate change.
These climate summits are slow-moving and bureaucratic, and they're run on consensus. And getting 200-odd countries to agree to anything is really hard. So you have a country like the Marshall Islands, which is facing an existential threat from rising sea levels. And then you have a country like Saudi Arabia, where they're hugely reliant on fossil fuels for their national income. So compromise in these situations is very hard.
At COP26, deliberations involve not just world leaders, but many backroom negotiators struggling to have their country's interests met. Reporting for the daily radio program The World, Carolyn Beeler followed a negotiator from Palau, an island nation in the Pacific, with a dire plea for his region.
You have a lot of WhatsApp messages.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
I got to follow around Xavier Matsutaro for a day at the climate summit, and he had been going to these as a negotiator for a few years. He told me about, the impacts that his country was already seeing. A dock that he used to jump off and swim when he was little was no longer in place because of rising sea levels. Some of the taro fields of farmers that he knew had been inundated and were no longer viable.
Are you thinking daily about what this all means for Palau, for your home country?
That's probably the hardest part. It's the pressure. It's the pressure to deliver on behalf of not only your country, but your region. You're essentially the voice of those that could not come, the voice of those that are the most vulnerable.
I think that they are, especially the Pacific Islands, especially the Marshall Islands, are taking a stand because they're saying we are really the absolute front lines of climate change. Because, we're at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming already. When we hit 1.5, the prediction was these islands are not going to exist anymore. That could happen in 10, 15 years. The governments, the activists in those countries are going to continue to be as loud as they possibly can to point out the injustice.
We return now to the COP26 Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland. Covering politicians sitting around discussing it, policymakers, is one part of the story, and it's important. But it's also so important to talk to the people who are right now experiencing the effects of climate change.
PBS NewsHour focused much of its coverage on people around the world whose lives have been upended because of the changing climate. People like Mohammed Narob in Bangladesh.
I had run a business before, but the business is no more now. The shops, the houses have been devoured by the river.
He is one of those stories that is emblematic of what is facing millions of Bangladeshis. The repeated floods that have happened in his family forced his family to leave where they had lived before and move to higher ground.
My country, Bangladesh, is on the delta of two of the world's biggest rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. So we regularly get flooded by these two rivers, and at the same time we regularly get cyclonic storms coming from the south. And we have a very, very low-lying coastal zone with millions, tens of millions of people living there who are extremely vulnerable to both the floods from the rivers as well as the cyclones from the sea.
Mohammed is many, many, many people in the not too distant future.
Climate migration is relatively small compared to what it's going to be like in future years. And I think we're going to see a lot of political consequences, rising xenophobia, very worrying consequences as a result of greater climate migration.
But political challenges are not the only obstacles to climate progress.
There are vested interests that benefit from the continued burning of fossil fuels. And so there's a lot of interest and a lot of money and a lot of pressure on leaders to maintain the status quo.
Hi, good to see you. How are you?
Last year, Greenpeace approached Alex Thompson of Britain's Channel 4 News with a bombshell sting operation caught on tape.
Greenpeace came along and said, we're going to pose as an oil exec interested in making a move within the industry, and we're going to record covertly an interview with a senior guy from Exxon.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that.
Yeah. It wasn't just amazing the way he unfolded, the whole grand scale story. Everything you ever thought about a massive multinational oil and gas company absolutely laid out there, from this is how we buy up politicians, this is how we deny climate change.
Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker, and he's not shy about sort of staking his claim early and completely changing the debate.
Finally, you're getting it from the horse's mouth. And everything the oil companies say in denial of this, is just not true.
It's one thing to be skeptical in the abstract. It's another to see Exxon's top lobbyist in Washington admit it on camera. Exxon immediately tried to disavow any knowledge of this person. They said we're shocked by his statements. He himself expressed regret about it. That kind of reporting makes me very proud as a journalist, frankly, that we are able to really show the public that that's what's stopping us.
The bottom line is it's going to take political courage, political will, in order to get something done. And that doesn't exist in politics. It just doesn't.
Even without hurdles to curbing climate change, the sheer enormity of the challenge is hard to fathom.
Climate change has made it, particularly when you get to the end of extreme drought, it's made it impossible to fight these fires. There's no winning.
Brandon Clement and Jonathan Petromala explore the devastating situation facing California. In their series for the Weather Company, Parched and in Peril, they look at how record heat and punishing drought is making life for many unsustainable.
The drought was so low that Lake Oroville wasn't able to produce electricity. You had power shortages, you had water shortages, you had crops dying and trees dying, and one of the most important agricultural regions of the world.
In Reedley, California, farmer Lizette Garcia struggles with her wells running dry.
She could work 24 hours a day, but there's nothing she can do about the fact that she does not have the water.
Honestly, right now I feel like I'm living not even in the US, like I'm living out in the village somewhere, because I have to bring out buckets of water to do daily necessities, such as shower, such as using the toilet, such as washing the dishes.
Things are drying up. She's going by hand for hours, watering each plant, because these plants are more than just a way to make money. She loves these plants. You physically take care of them.
Yeah, I'm physically carrying them.
And the predictable consequence of extreme drought? Wildfires. The dry forests that remain after repeated heat waves and little water has completely changed the behavior of wildfires all across the American West.
These huge mega fires, this is a new thing. This is kind of a thing that didn't exist. It's one after the other, just giant fires. That's just unheard of. And that is from drought.
At this point, we're fighting the fires of the future, because the future's already here.
So multiple obstacles stand in the way of change, but it doesn't mean the problem is insurmountable.
I think at a certain point, no one's going to be able to ignore climate change, and that's going to make it harder for vested interests to lobby their way out of an energy transition.
The cost of inaction becomes clearer and clearer every day, and the cost of action is increasingly shrinking. When you think about the cost that could be averted later down the road, I think that formula is starting to be upended now, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that an investment today can really help pay dividends down the road. But you have to be willing to make that argument, and that's the difficulty we have today.
A lot of competing interests, but the bottom line, it's clear climate change is already making areas of the planet unlivable, so millions of folks have no choice but to move.
Just how big will the issue of climate migration become? That's our next burning question.
24 million people globally have moved because of the changing climate. But that's 24 million that we know of. We're talking about enormous amount of people, entire generations trying to find a place to live.
Across the globe, millions are at risk of losing more than just their land. Their culture, their way of life, their very identity is at the mercy of the changing climate. To capture the oral history of communities at the forefront of climate change, independent journalist Chandrani Sinha traveled down India's Brahmaputra River, chronicling the traditional folk songs of those who call the riverbanks home.
You will see a lot of similarities of the stories. The emotions are similar, but the stories of every village is different.
আপনি যে কথা বলছেন আমার চোখে জল আসে কারণ এই নদী আমরা ছোট সময় থেকে ভাবি এই বছরে এই জায়গাটা রাখবে কিন্তু রাখে না।
The songs of loss and longing Sinha recorded share stories of land gone due to the flooding and erosion of the river basin, and traditions eroding along with it.
Tomorrow, if water comes and it just take away everything of mine, what will I be? So you will feel the sorrow, the sadness in their songs.
It's a sadness that transcends international borders. The fear of loss felt on the riverbanks of India, the same fears felt thousands of miles away throughout the fields of America's heartland.
Lately, climate change has made farming really hard.
In the series Through Our Eyes, documentarians Jim and Talea McMahon chronicle the climate crisis through the eyes of children.
The issue of climate change is only going to become more and more relevant to future generations. They're the people who really have to grapple with this.
I've lived here 11 years, which is my entire life, and so is Leo.
This farm occupies a very special place in my heart. It's been in the family for 163 years.
Since 2016, 6.5 million Americans have faced climate displacement.
Because of flooding and drought, they're coming to the realization that this is just not sustainable.
The weather has been changing, so we had like a huge drought, and then there's a ton of rain for like a week or two.
Or we have 8-degree temperatures at the end of October, and then it's 60 in January.
If the weather patterns are changing from historical norms, what happens is that it disrupts the yield of crops and makes it so that people earn less money. That's a recipe for disaster.
Losing the business also means losing your home. And the girls are very aware of this.
Any kid can tell when their parents are stressed out. I don't want to move, but it'd give us enough money to pay off like a lot of our debt that we used for farming. But I want to stay here, of course.
Shortly after we finished filming, they ended up moving to a teaching farm in Virginia. And so the girls do live on a farm currently. It's not their farm, but they still get to have that life that they love.
In Texas, the McMahons follow another young girl and her family, displaced by Hurricane Harvey and the flooding that followed.
I was 6 when Hurricane Harvey hit.
In 2017, Hurricane Harvey was heading for the Texas Gulf Coast, and Mariah and her family went to stay with family in Houston because they live in a rural area that might have been hit harder.
The wind was howling.
And it just like kept raining hard. The lights would just keep on going on and off.
After the flooding subsided, the family went back to see what had happened with their home. It was devastating. Mariah's grandfather built the house. She had only ever known that house.
When we finally arrived to her house, we were shocked.
You could see the literal wires.
It was sad. My mother was born in the house.
One thing I was particularly surprised by is how long it takes families to recover. You see that in Mariah's story. So when we meet them, it's 3 years later. Their home is in the process of being rebuilt, and they have to live in a motel.
This desk is where I do my school every day, and I try to move stuff so I can have a space to eat.
Mariah's grandmother makes a choice that a lot of Americans make regardless of their financial situation, which is to stay in their communities.
I frequently wondered why people don't leave after multiple disasters. And I no longer question that. When you don't have the resources, the reality of it is that there's not really anywhere for them to go. We live in California, which is experiencing its own climate crisis.
We have fires, a water shortage. It is unclear how long we can stay here. How do you know when it's time to leave?
For many, the time to leave is now. Changing weather patterns and rising sea levels are forcing millions from their homes across the globe.
An unexpected tide swept away Zainabou Fall's home. With it, a lifetime of memories.
In Senegal, it's an all too common story. Journalists Nick Hawk and Hugo Bogart documented the devastating consequences as the sea swallows part of Senegal's historic coastline.
I want to go to places that are underreported. That's why I came to Dakar, Senegal.
The eye of the world is not really focused on this part of the world, which is a shame because people are definitely suffering here.
We're being forced to live a difficult life here. This was supposed to be temporary, and we're living here now for 2 years. There's no food, no help, and no sign from authorities anything will change. We won't be able to return home.
This rising ocean has become a curse. This place where they could fish is no longer a place where they can fish because there's less fish in the ocean. Not only that, their homes are being destroyed. So they have only one solution, is to leave.
With nowhere left to go, many are forced to escape by boat, facing dangerous seas in search of a safer place to live.
People are desperate now. That's why so many young people are leaving Saint-Louis to try to get to Europe.
They get on a boat, they leave their families behind, and some of them just disappear.
They take their traditional Senegalese fishing boats. The sea is very unpredictable, causing many boats to capsize, and people just drown because they don't know how to swim.
No one wants to leave their homes. No one wants to really migrate and leave the land that generations have lived upon. If they could live happily in their environment, they would just stay where they are. But they're forced to do it because they're trying to find a safer place to live.
For Nick, the feeling of loss and mourning is personal.
I'm a second-generation climate migrant. My parents left Bangladesh because their home disappeared into the water. Not being able to go back to that pond where my mother learned how to swim, not able to see that history, there's an immense sense of grief.
As land and identities slip away into the rising ocean and huge populations are forced to leave their homelands, we are at great risk of losing our collective human history. Who will carry on the stories of those left behind?
The city that is disappearing and all these other coastal cities have a deep history. That's why I think it's really important for us to try to preserve those cities and to tell the story of climate change and how this is affecting not only our environment, but our human history.
It's a cruel reality. Most of the pollution that's overheating the planet has come from industrialized places, the US, China, Europe. But the people getting hit the hardest are in poor countries where emissions are low. Places like Bangladesh, Kenya, and the Pacific Islands, a paradise that is sounding the alarm and fighting for its life.
Some of the cyclones that have occurred in the past 5 years and 10 years has been some of the most severe that have occurred in our hemisphere.
I see these big waves as weapons of war that are destroying our livelihoods and our survival.
Some have lost lives. Majority would just lose everything and have to start all over again.
Pacific Islanders are at the forefront of the climate crisis. Rising sea temperatures fuel tropical cyclones. Flooding and erosion are threatening their very existence, their livelihood, and their identity.
Entire nations are at stake. Those entire nations are small, but it doesn't lessen their value. It doesn't lessen the value of the cultures, the identities, and the sense of place that comes with it.
In a podcast for The Guardian, An Impossible Choice, Langapoiva Sherelle Jackson chronicles the difficult choices many face as life on the islands becomes increasingly hard to sustain.
If tomorrow the land disappears from beneath your feet, are you going to leave? And that's an impossible choice because we are a people of the land. Pacific Islanders are very much about the land and that sense of place.
Culture is based on lands, the connections between the individual and the oceans, the lagoons, the waters.
Jackson interviewed people like Inele Sopoana, the former prime minister of Tuvalu, a country grappling with the potential end of its existence, where the average height of the island is less than 6 feet above sea level.
If nothing is done urgently, there would come a time that the islands of Tuvalu and many low-lying islands like Tuvalu would be completely uninhabitable.
In December of 2012, when Cyclone Evan slammed Samoa, Vanessa Roche Neuenhausen and her children were overcome by massive storm surges.
It started raining really, really heavy. By 4:30, we started seeing some water rising, just around the house. So my husband, he said to me, get the kids, grab the kids. By the time we got out of the house, we were already struggling. That's how quick the water came. I had 2 kids with me, both hands, and there was a point where we were looking at each other like, are we going to make a decision to let one of them go?
The water was pretty strong, and obviously I'm a tiny person. But I just couldn't let go, couldn't make that decision as to who to let go.
The family survived, but they lost nearly everything, and they made the difficult decision to move to Australia.
To leave all of that. It was a hard decision. There's something about that's where you were born and the land, the ocean, everything, is part of you. You're a part of that. And so leaving home is like leaving a child.
Who are we? Who are you? Who am I except that our accumulated experiences of where we grew up, where we live?
In many Pacific countries, our graves are inside the homes. So if you're going to move from your home, you move the bones with. If the whole community moves, that's an essential part of the community. That's where we descend from, and those are the ancestors we continue to honor. So that power of place and of history and of culture, you can't just up and leave.
We talk about the climate crisis as if it's a manageable event. And it's not. It's not a manageable event because it's destroying communities.
I have always resisted giving my support to the option of relocation and resettlement. I think this, for me as a leader, this would be a denial of the rights of the people of Tuvalu to survive, to continue to survive peacefully and in their God-given islands. I'm not giving up hope. I'm not giving up hope. I certainly believe that if we save Tuvalu, we save the world.
But like Vanessa, Langapoiva ultimately made the difficult choice to leave Samoa. Now based in Portland, she carries reminders of her home, symbols of where she has come from and who she is.
I was displaced from my home country. So telling that story of an impossible choice of whether to stay or leave was such an emotional journey for me because I was experiencing it at the time. These tattoos are meant to be for daughters of high chiefs, and it's a rite of passage. It tells the story of our culture. This is what ties us to our land and to our place. I am still of that place because of my lineage and my bloodline.
Like Langapoiva Jackson, many of today's reporters understand from personal experience that climate change affects all of us. They feel an urgency to share the science and the impacts and increasingly potential solutions.
I think reporting on climate has definitely opened my eyes, thinking about the connections between climate and other things.
Justin Worland is a senior correspondent at Time magazine and is covering Climate Now's Climate Journalist of the Year.
I've learned a lot about not just climate, but also about the world.
Justin does some of the best nitty-gritty reporting on climate change of anybody out there.
He writes about climate as it relates to business, as it relates to politics, as it relates to culture. He really does embody the sense that the climate story is every story.
To further strengthen climate coverage, Justin co-founded a network for journalists of color who cover environmental issues, the Uproot Project.
And so we came together in 2019 and thought about what are the ways in which we can help create a pathway for journalists of color to get involved with covering climate change and environmental issues. How do we change the conversation around climate and make it something that's not just about carbon in the atmosphere, but also about things that affect people's lives, including people of color and diverse communities. And so it's critically important for journalists to give that full picture, to say this is a really bad problem. We also have really good solutions. We just need to make sure we implement them. Because the story can't just be about problems. It can't just be about solutions, giving people false hope. It's got to be problem, solution, put those two together.
I think one of the really exciting parts of the climate story in the last year has been the increasing attention to solutions.
What we saw was a shift from the disaster narratives, the polar bears, melting glaciers, to really looking at, okay, what are we doing to address this issue? And psychologically, that's actually a really good shift for us to do in climate journalism because it's frustrating, it's scary, they don't want to hear about it. But as we're shifting to solutions, I think people are getting more engaged.
It's not enough to tell people how bad it is. At this point, people kind of get that. And what often turns them off or paralyzes them is the sense that, there's nothing to be done about it. And in fact, the solutions are here.
When we say solutions journalism, we're not talking about good news. We're really talking about investigative journalism. It's just investigating and holding accountable the solutions that corporations, governments, and other stakeholders bring to this party. Because a lot of people have really great ideas on how to solve the issues around climate change. Not all of them are good, and not all of them are viable.
A good example? A Los Angeles Times investigation into extreme heat's deadly toll.
We're really fixated on the fact that extreme heat is the deadliest consequence of global warming by far, killing more people than any other weather-related disaster. But we didn't feel like it got the attention that it deserved.
The team discovering that the state had commissioned a study over a decade ago, laying out solutions to avoid needless deaths.
It had a bit of a feeling of a government report that was gathering dust on the shelf. When we asked how many had been fulfilled, there was a lot that just had not moved forward. It's things that are relatively easy to do. Things like tracking and responding to the number of heat illnesses that are reported in hospitals. It's things like getting people to air-conditioned spaces when the risk is highest. These are things that will save people's lives and aren't necessarily being done.
Journalism can help in lots of different ways. It could help by pointing out the solutions that we have that aren't being implemented, where people are just, dragging their feet or not acting fast enough.
The team began crunching the data to decipher how many deaths of Californians could be attributed to extreme heat over the course of a decade. The official tally, 599.
And what we learned was that the true toll is likely 6 times higher than that 599 deaths. Closer to 4,000 people died in California from extreme heat over that period.
In that LA Times series, what was so effective is that they were both doing this data-driven analysis, and they were showing the individual person whose parent died because they couldn't get in contact with them, and that elderly parent was living in a home without air conditioning.
One thing I would say that a lot of those interviews had in common was a feeling of shame that I didn't do more to protect my father. I didn't do more to protect my sister.
Reporter Anna Phillips tracked down some of the stories of the invisible victims of extreme heat, like 70-year-old Ann Gakambi Methu.
She had Alzheimer's. She was in an assisted living facility in Riverside, California. It gets up to 118 degrees in Riverside. Incredibly hot. Anne is allowed to leave the facility and to kind of walk around a courtyard, and she's out there for hours. I talked to her children almost a year after she died, and they were still, I think, in a state of shock. Anne had immigrated to the US from Kenya. Her children had followed her mostly, as adults. And I think the idea that you could come here and die from heat is a really difficult idea to kind of get your mind around.
What the data shows just about access to air conditioning, about heat illness and fatalities are that, yes, low-income communities, communities of color, particularly Black Californians and the elderly, are most at risk of heat illness and of dying from extreme heat.
After their reporting, California Governor Gavin Newsom and local authorities made new pledges of solutions.
We don't need new technologies. We have about 95% of the technologies we need with renewable energy, solar, wind, battery storage, especially energy efficiency. We have these solutions.
So 2 things are happening at once. We are advancing solutions. We are advancing this conversation, but it needs to happen faster than the warming.
I think that we have a focus on mitigation, which is, stopping sending carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and adaptation, which is figuring out, okay, how are we going to get people on the West Coast AC units who didn't have them before?
For younger journalists, exploring potential solutions is especially urgent.
I think we saw with the youth climate movement how much momentum there is among my generation, how much people in my generation understand the stakes and really want to act. There are lots of ways that people can make small decisions, and whether that's getting involved in an activist movement and holding your local leaders to account, or doing something personal like deciding to invest in a bike and not driving, or deciding to not fly for a year. I think all of those decisions matter, but paralysis doesn't lead us to any of those. There are a lot of smart people working on this. A lot of smart people have proposed a lot of good answers. We know what the answers are. I don't know if people are ready to make the hard decisions that get us to those answers. And that's people in power and kind of the everyday person.
Climate change presents a really interesting challenge for journalists, right? Journalists are meant to be dispassionate to some degree, are meant to check their personal biases at the door. But I think what's interesting about climate change is that it's okay to say, actually, I want the world to be a livable place.
What gives me hope is that more and more people seem to want this kind of coverage. People respond to that. When we do deeper, more substantive looks at technological solutions or impacts elsewhere in the world, people are interested and seemingly hungry for that.
It's not a story of despair. The bad news is it might happen, the worst, but it doesn't have to happen if we prepare ourselves. And we, the people, need to be the ones to prepare ourselves. Don't rely on our leaders to make the decisions for us.
This is one of the biggest challenges that humanity has ever faced, but it's also one of the most interesting challenges. There was a period of time where it looked like we weren't going to get clean energy to be cheap, and people just had no idea. I mean, how are we going to address this problem? Are we going to be in a situation where billions of people around the world are going to be facing really catastrophic situation? That's still possible, but it's less likely. And I think it's important that we tell that story as well.
There isn't, one thing that's really going to save us. It's about taking everything we know, all of the different tools in the toolbox, and using them to the best that we can. There's a lot that can be done and should be done.
So one of the most important things each of us can do about climate change is talking about it and the burning questions it raises. We got to talk with our families, our friends, our coworkers, and the more we know about the problem and its solutions, the more constructive our conversations will be.
Such a good point, and that's why good climate journalism is so essential. Only when we all understand what's at stake and how to fix it can we find a way forward together.
We want to thank you for watching.
Funding for this program was provided by Sustainable Markets Foundation, Schumann Media Center, Park Foundation, One Earth Fund, Rockefeller Family Fund, the Michaud Family Foundation, Taylor Family Charitable Fund, and Actions at EBMF.